All right. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to another weekly live stream with yours truly, Dr. Sarah Webb, the founder of Colorism Healing. This week, we are talking about colorism and microaggressions and how microaggressions that are based in colorism are one of the barriers to inclusion in and belonging. This is part of an ongoing series on corporate colorism specifically. If you've been around a while, you know I've created lots of content about colorism in all arenas of life. And for the past 14 or 15 weeks, I've been focusing on how colorism shows up in the workplace in the form of corporate colorism. And so I do like interactive lives. I will save time at the end for questions and comments, but feel free to engage in the chat along the way. Hey, Aya, I see you. And a lot of people, when we think about microaggressions, a lot of times we focus on racial microaggressions. You've probably heard of racial microaggressions, and a lot of people see that as, oh, white people do these things to people of color, to Black people, to BIPOC folks. And they see it as something that happens across races. So someone from a different race committing a microaggression against you because you're Black or because you're Asian, right? But colorism is also a source of microaggressions. And so when we look at microaggressions through the lens of colorism, we're reminded that microaggressions can come even from people of your same race. Microaggressions based on colorism happen across races and within an individual race. And when we strive for inclusion and belonging, a lot of times, way too often, colorism is unaddressed, unacknowledged. There's a lack of awareness around colorism. And when it does get talked about, when we do bring up colorism in the context of the workplace, as many of my previous sessions have alluded to or talked about, so if you haven't seen those, make sure you go back and watch them. We talk about disparities in hiring, the disparities in pay, or the egregious, overt, blatant forms of colorism, the ones that are easy to see and recognize, quote unquote. But when we think about microaggressions, it's one of the more subtle forms of colorism. Just like microaggressions tend to be subtle forms of racism or sexism, right? So even in the context, when we're looking at the framework of colorism, microaggressions is when colorism takes on a more subtle tone, okay? And a lot of times we talk about, there's debate around the word micro. Is it really a microaggression or is it just an outright aggression? And so I agree with those people who say, you know, they're not small aggressions, right? Aggression is aggression. And so I think the term microaggression comes because these instances are not overt, because they're not loud, because they're often subtle. A lot of times they are guised under, you know, niceness or helpfulness, right? And so they're sometimes harder to prove. So when we think about, for example, someone saying, oh, I don't like your dark skin, right? Like that would be an obvious instance of colorism versus someone subtly saying, oh, well, you know, maybe you should stand a little farther to the back, right? Or maybe you need to add a little extra lighting and before we take the photo of you, right? And so things that are often associated with gaslighting, I think microaggressions easily lend themselves to gaslighting precisely because there's that element of plausible deniability, right? And we might see it as passive aggressive forms of comments. Some people call it backhanded compliments, right? All these ways that people are insulting you or alienating you or pointing out how you don't fit in, right? Without directly saying it, without directly going to the point. But the other side of microaggressions, and this is the form of microaggression that I've most often experienced, is what's not said. And I think a lot of times we ignore that or we miss that in conversations around microaggressions. It's just as often what people are not saying. It's just as often what doesn't happen, right? And then even reminding ourselves that microaggressions include actions. I know a lot of times we focus on words. A lot of times we focus on statements, things that people say that are a form of microaggressions. But a microaggression can be an action, right? You see someone is reaching for a coffee cup and you grab it before they can get it, right? knowing good and well that they had set that up, they were going in for it, and you cut them off without saying anything. Like, so you don't have to say things, you don't have to make comments to still be perpetuating microaggressions. Another example is when people go before you in line, even though you were waiting, right? And so it's like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see you. Or they assume that everyone should just stop what they're doing and serve them before everyone else who had already been waiting. And so we have to think about microaggressions, yes, as comments that people make, but also things that people are not saying, and actions or inactions that people do. And so one example that I experienced that I saw clearly in my own professional experience was having a colleague walk by my office every day and not speak, not acknowledge, not peek her head in to say hello, and then would promptly give a warm and bubbly greeting to the person in the office next door to mine, right? So that's an example of a microaggression that doesn't require a comment. It doesn't require that colleague saying something to me or making a comment towards me. Really, the microaggression was all wrapped up in the fact that that colleague did not say anything to me, that that colleague walked past without a peep, without a word, right? Like that was the microaggression, is what she didn't say. And then paired or contrast with her warm, welcoming, bubbly, enthusiastic greeting and chatter with the colleague right next door, right? And then seeing this repeatedly on multiple occasions, right? So it's not like, oh, on that particular day, I just had something really urgent to tell this colleague, right? But it was a pattern, it was a recurring pattern. So microaggressions, again, in the context of colorism, we see that they happen even amongst people of the same race. And so we have, I mentioned this a little bit in prior weeks, but how there's this cliquish behavior, or there's the attitude that, oh, this person is hard to work with, this person is difficult to work with, or, you know, we just don't like their leadership style, right? Like these very vague, ambiguous complaints. And so I want to share some specific examples just of things that people might say, and then also actions that people might take, and then how colorism exacerbates racial microaggressions as well. So for those who are less aware of, you know, what colorism might look like, here are some things that you might hear that are tied to stereotypes, biases, perceptions around skin tone specifically. One is when people say, oh, I'm as dark as you, or I'm darker than you are now, right? A question somebody might ask, someone asked me this before in the past, can you get a tan? Oh, I didn't think you could actually get darker if you went out in the sun. Another one, which is kind of the opposite, is when people say, oh, you're not even that dark. And this is a microaggression / form of gaslighting, when someone around my shade is talking about colorism. And then instead of people saying like, oh, like acknowledging the incident that I'm talking about, they say, but you're not even that dark, right? That's not helpful in the moment. And then another one is, you don't look blank. This is a very, very common one, and it's based on colorism, but also racial stereotypes and ethnic stereotypes about what a black person from a certain part of the world should look like, or what an Asian person from a certain part of the world should look like, or what a white person, like whoever the group is, right? These ideas and stereotypes are closely tied up into like, oh, well, your skin is too dark to be Hispanic or Latino, or your hair is too curly to be Asian, right? Like all these different things that are based in stereotypes of what the typical representation is of that race or ethnicity. A common one, you're pretty for a dark girl. This is a comment loosely based in something that a follower said to me before, is people book you for talent and they just book me for my looks, or vice versa, right? Like, oh, people book me for my talent, they just book you for your looks, right? And so colorism can also exacerbate racial microaggressions. So all of the microaggressions, all of the stereotypes, all of the biases and discrimination that we already know exist because of racial bias and because of racist stereotypes. Research, again, check the previous live streams in this series. But the research shows that these things are disproportionately impacting those with the darkest skin tones in the race. It is amplified and magnified, these biases and stereotypes. The darker your skin tone is, the curlier your hair texture is, the broader your nose is, etc. And so racist stereotypes such as, oh, she's rude, or she's so aggressive, or he's so hard to work with, why are you so unapproachable? Okay, enough with the impressions there. But yeah, so all Black people, for example, could experience that type of stereotype, could experience that type of discrimination, or bias, or microaggression. But we know from our anecdotal testimonials, again, as well as research on stereotypes and biases, that you're far more likely to see a dark-skinned Black woman as too aggressive or too rude than a very light-skinned Black woman. Another common microaggression that happens based on skin tone, as well as other things, gender, right? All sorts of intersectional identities play into these microaggressions and stereotypes, is making assumptions about someone's job title or position. And so I've had this happen where people defer to the lighter skinned person in the room, or they defer to like the non-Black person in the room, or they defer to the white person in the room as if they're the leader by default, right? Like, oh, this light-skinned person or this non-Black person is by default going to be the representative or the spokesperson, or they're the boss innately. It's so annoying and so frustrating, right? And oftentimes we're peers, right? We're equal colleagues. Sometimes, the darker skinned person will actually be the leader or the head or the chair in that instance. But that default assumption, and before my corporate colorism series, I talked about this in going out to eat with people, and always noticing like, who does the waiter or waitress give the check to? And I've noticed that even when I give the waiter my check, sometimes, doesn't happen like every time I go out to eat, but sometimes like even after I'm the one who gave the check, like they'll still bring it back to the other person that I'm eating with, right? So it's subtle things like that, but they add up, they accumulate. And that's the conversation around microaggressions and why they're just as harmful, why they're just as detrimental. And next week, I'm talking about wellness and health impacts of colorism. And so microaggressions accumulate, and part of what makes them so stressful is the subtlety of them. Part of what makes a microaggression so traumatic and stressful and hard to process and hard to move through is the fact that it's hard to explain it to people, right? And there's a disenfranchisement when you can't articulate what is happening. And when people say, well, you sure? I didn't really see it that way, or maybe she was just being helpful, right? And so that's part of why microaggressions are so detrimental. Because if you were just cussing me out and you just called me the N-word, people would identify that as a problem. People would address that. People would come and say, oh no, that's bad behavior. We shouldn't do that. And, people would hopefully show up and hold that person accountable. But the reason why I think people who perpetuate violence and who are trying to uphold oppressive systems resort to quote unquote microaggressions and the passive aggressive subtle forms of discrimination and degradation is because they're more likely to get away with it. And so that's part of why we have to take microaggressions seriously, is because they actually might take a bigger toll on minoritized and marginalized populations. One, because they can happen more often, and two, because it's so much harder to find redress and to have recourse in response to these things. One thing I talked about last week was disregarding chain of command. So if, a dark-skinned person is the director or the head, people might try to work around them to not have to work directly with them. And so they'll go to other people when the protocol is that you report to this person first, right? And then, I already mentioned deferring to the lighter skinned person as the decision maker, right? Okay, so again, I am available for speaking and training on these topics if you'd like to go deeper. Your homework is to believe dark-skinned Black women. Believe other folks as well if they're talking about their lived experience, right? But in particular, when it comes to the gaslighting around colorism, dark-skinned Black women receive the brunt of that gaslighting and that dismissal. I literally, because I follow the hashtag colorism on Instagram, I was literally scrolling through Instagram and there was this headline, "Colorism is just in dark-skinned women's minds." And this caller, this Black guy, called in to this show and he was like, "Oh, I think colorism is just something that exists in the minds of dark-skinned Black women because, they see that we have preferences for light-skinned women." And so it's really frustrating because I work like really, really hard to dispel these myths. And then when you see like how pervasive and persistent they still are, it's just like, well, dang. Okay. And then your affirmation is, I don't have to explain my feelings to anyone. And so some things to not say, like really, if someone says, "Oh, I feel like this person is treating me differently," and I suspect it has to do with my skin tone, just accept that, right? Don't say, "Oh, well, maybe they're just ignorant." Oh, they're just ignorant. They're not really racist. They're not really colorist. They just don't know. Don't skip that part. Just skip that part, okay? All right, let's get into your questions. 15 minutes again. I'm doing good on time, like consistently good on time. All right, let's see. Michael and Aya holding it down on LinkedIn. Hey, LinkedIn user. For some reason, I can't see your name on the restream. Aya says, "The lack of acknowledgement is on purpose by design to make you question your experience." Yes, that's what gaslighting is. It's, planting those seeds of doubt, plausible deniability, like, "Oh, I don't know. You sure? Well, I didn't seem that way. I'm sure she didn't mean anything by it." Let's see. Oh, love your new accent, Dr. Sarah. Okay, y'all, it's Gemini season, so I might be doing the most on these lives. We are all socialized and conditioned to do that. The entertainment industry makes a point to brainwash us, and yes, the effect is cumulative. Cumulative compounded trauma. It's a physical thing, right? Like compound or complex trauma is when like you have repeated damage to a particular part of your body that creates this injury instead of like just a one acute incident where you like break your arm. It's like this compounding trauma where smaller impacts over time create a problem for you. And so the same thing happens psychologically. The same thing happens emotionally. I really don't even understand why Black men feel the need to say these things. And Michael says, "F those preferences." Yeah. Says, "Instead of responding like a brother or father or friend, they immediately try to weaponize our feelings." Sad. Yeah, fellow Gemini. Okay. Thank you for that point though, Aya. I think instead of responding like a brother, father, or friends, or just a citizen of the world, they are very dismissive. And I think far too many black men have not reconciled with the ways that colorism is killing them as well. I'm going to talk about this on 6/12, on June 12th, the truth about racial profiling. So for all the black men who want to, especially dark-skinned black men who want to dismiss colorism as just being an issue with dark-skinned women, like these biases and stereotypes based on skin tone are killing y'all. Like, yeah, you might get more clout. You might get more social clout. You might get a little social status or bump for being a dark-skinned man in a society that, prioritizes or associates masculinity with darker skin. But at the same time, it's making you be perceived as more threatening. You're perceived as more criminal, right? And so that has a direct cause of police killings and racial profiling, right? So it's detrimental, and I said this before, but any system that oppresses some of us is likely to oppress all of us. And so we can't be satisfied with like, oh, well, as long as it's them, as long as it's those people over there being oppressed, then we're good. We're not going to pay attention. We're just going to participate in the status quo because, they come for your neighbors and then the next day they're knocking on your door as well. Okay? And let's see what's up on Instagram. Hey, Instagram folks. All the beautiful, beautiful Graham fam. Y'all have any questions or comments for me? None. Oh, I see a lot of people watching, but y'all are quiet. Y'all lurking. Okay, I'll take it though. I'll take it. We can end the live stream early. We're at 11:20, which I think is great timing. So with the upcoming live streams, I have 3 left after this one. The next one will be on Monday, May 29th, and I'm going to be talking about the impact of colorism on health, physical health and well-being. And then I'm going to take a birthday break the week of June 6th, okay? Then I'll be back June 12th for the truth about racial profiling. I just realized that's Aya's birthday, so happy early birthday to you. And then the last live stream in the spring season is going to be on June 19th, and I'm going to talk about solutions to corporate colorism. So go back and catch up if you haven't seen previous episodes, and then join me on June 19th, Juneteenth celebration in the house for solutions to corporate colorism. And then I will go on a summer hiatus, a well-deserved summer break, resting, and then also preparing for the fall season of live streams, where we will continue the conversation, okay? All right, so I see some people have had a chance to get questions in. Says, how are your suggestions on addressing this? I'll watch and join. Addressing colorism in particular, or addressing microaggressions? Yeah, thank you. Let's see, Alexis on LinkedIn says, have you had the opportunity to partner with any organizations to study colorism? So I've studied colorism in my own academic research, one with my own dissertation, but also collaborating with other scholars to look at, for example, research on colorism in police killings. If you Google colorism in police killings, my name will pop up on at least one of the research studies done on that. All right. Yeah, so I sprinkle solutions to colorism throughout all my content. So pretty much the hundreds of videos at this point that I've posted, which are easiest to access on YouTube, I usually provide some information, and then I give a call to action, or I give people homework of something that they can do. I have specific dedicated videos, posts on Instagram, posts on LinkedIn, giving people advice, giving people suggestions. And so, yeah, the solutions are always sprinkled throughout all of my content. But on the 19th, on June 19th, the live stream again will be specifically dedicated to looking at solutions to corporate colorism. And again, that's based on the 16-week series that I've done, explaining all the ways that colorism shows up in the workplace and in the workplace pipeline. So Alexis says, I study police officers as well. We'll definitely look up your work. I am currently a PhD student. Oh, excellent, Alexis. Yeah, I do so many, I put out so much content. I always forget what I said, when I said it, and to whom I was saying it. But I remember saying at some point that I would love to give researchers ideas on how they can address colorism in their research, or how ideas for research studies that include colorism or that focus on colorism. Because now that I'm out of academia, now that I'm no longer a full-time professor, the heavy research side is not a part of my everyday work and operations. But I have plenty of ideas for people who are still actively in research mode. All right, folks. This was a great live. Thank you so much for your contributions in the chat, the live chat. If you're watching the replay, be sure to like, share, subscribe, do all the things. And I'll see y'all next week for a discussion on colorism's impact on physical health and wellness. All right, much love.